She was 19 years old, standing in a dressing room backstage at CBS Studio 50 in Manhattan, wearing a white tutu that caught the harsh fluorescent light. Her name was written on a piece of paper taped to the mirror, her first time seeing her own name on a Broadway dressing room door. Outside, stagehands were setting up for the Ed Sullivan Show's Sunday night broadcast. She could hear the orchestra warming up, the distant murmur of the audience filling the theater. She'd rehearsed for 2 weeks. Her routine was 8 minutes of classical ballet, choreographed to Tchaikovsky. Everything was ready. Her pointe shoes were broken in perfectly. Her hair was pinned so tight it pulled at her temples. In 3 hours, she would perform on the most watched variety show in America. Except 30 minutes ago, a man in a grey suit had knocked on her door and told her there was a problem. The sponsor, a major automobile company whose commercials paid for the entire show, had just learned that a Negro dancer would be performing alongside white dancers in the same number. They were threatening to pull their funding. Ed Sullivan had been summoned to a meeting, and she was told to wait. So she sat on a folding chair in her white tutu, hands folded in her lap, listening to the clock on the wall tick toward airtime, waiting to find out if her dream would be allowed to exist. What Ed Sullivan decided in the next hour would determine not just her career, but whether millions of Americans would see a young black woman dance as an equal on national television in 1955. The silence in that dressing room was different from any silence she'd ever known. It wasn't the focused quiet before a performance. It wasn't the held breath before music begins. It was the silence of waiting to learn whether you matter, whether your talent is enough, whether the color of your skin will be treated as a problem that needs solving, or a fact that simply exists. She'd known this moment might come. Every black performer in America in 1955 knew it could come, but knowing didn't make it easier. She stood up, sat down, stood up again. She looked at herself in the mirror, the white tutu, the carefully applied stage makeup, the perfect posture drilled into her by years of training. She looked like every other ballerina, but she wasn't treated like every other ballerina. And right now, somewhere in this building, men in suits were deciding whether that difference mattered more than her dancing. The clock ticked, the orchestra played muffled scales through the walls, and she waited, alone, for someone else to decide her worth. Ed Sullivan was 64 years old in 1955, and he'd been hosting his Sunday night variety show for 7 years. It was the most powerful hour of television in America. More people watched the Ed Sullivan Show than any other program. Movie studios sent their biggest stars. Record labels sent their top acts. Broadway producers sent their best dancers. An appearance on Sullivan Show could make a career overnight. But that power came with strings attached. The show was expensive to produce. It needed sponsors, big sponsors with deep pockets to survive. And in 1955, those sponsors had power too. They could decide what appeared on the show and what didn't. They could threaten to pull funding if something made them uncomfortable. And a black dancer performing in an integrated ballet number made them very uncomfortable, not because of Sullivan, not because of CBS, but because their cars were sold in the South, where segregation wasn't just law, it was culture, identity, the entire social order. Showing a black woman and white women dancing together as equals could trigger boycotts, letters, lost sales. The sponsors' executives weren't necessarily personal racists, they were businessmen protecting profit, but the effect was the same. They wanted her removed from the show. In that moment, Ed Sullivan had 2 paths in front of him, and both had costs. He understood completely. He could give in. He could walk to that dressing room, apologize to the young dancer, explain that circumstances beyond his control made it impossible for her to perform tonight, offer her some vague promise about a future opportunity that might never come. The show would go on. The sponsor would be happy. The money would keep flowing. No one would blame him. This was 1955 after all. This was how things were. Fighting it would be impractical, financially reckless, possibly career-ending. The safe choice was obvious, or he could refuse. He could tell the sponsor that the dancer stays, and if they didn't like it, they could pull their money and he'd find another sponsor. But that wasn't a simple choice either. Finding a new sponsor on a Sunday afternoon was impossible. Losing this sponsor might mean losing others. It could damage relationships that took years to build. His producers would panic. CBS executives would be furious. And for what? For one dancer in one number in one episode of television that most people would forget by Monday morning. The practical arguments against fighting were overwhelming. The safe path was clear, but sitting in his office, looking at the contract on his desk and the phone that kept ringing with increasingly urgent calls from network executives, Ed Sullivan wasn't thinking about practicality. Ed Sullivan stood up from his desk and told his secretary he wasn't taking any more calls. He walked down the hallway toward the dressing rooms, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. Stagehands moved equipment around him. Someone called his name, another urgent message. But he didn't stop. He knocked on the young dancer's dressing room door. When she opened it, still in her white tutu, her eyes searching his face for the verdict, he saw something he recognized: fear, not of performing, not of failure, but of being erased, of working your entire life toward something and having it taken away for reasons that have nothing to do with your talent or your effort or your worth. He'd seen that look before, on other black performers, on Jewish comedians, on anyone who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable that sponsors and networks tried to enforce. And he was tired of it. He was tired of letting other people's fear dictate what America was allowed to see. "You're going on," he said. Not a question, not a discussion, a statement. "Get ready." The young dancer's eyes widened, but the sponsor, Sullivan, shook his head, cutting her off. "I don't care about the sponsor. You rehearsed. You're good. You're performing. That's the end of it." He paused, his voice getting quieter but no less firm. "And if anyone gives you trouble, you tell them to come talk to me." He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. "You nervous?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good," Sullivan said. "Use it. Dance like everyone's watching, because they will be." Then he left, walking back down the hallway to make phone calls he knew would be difficult, to have conversations he knew might cost him money, to defend a decision that made no practical sense, but was the only choice that let him look at himself in the mirror afterward. What happened next was documented in memos, phone calls and furious letters that still exist in network archives. Ed Sullivan called the sponsor's executive directly and told them the dancer was performing. The executive threatened to pull all funding immediately. Sullivan told them to go ahead. There was a long silence on the phone. The executive, clearly not expecting that response, tried a different approach. Couldn't they compromise? Move her to a different number? Have her perform alone instead of integrated? Sullivan refused every suggestion. "She's a dancer," he said. "She's going to dance with the other dancers in the number we rehearsed. If that's a problem for you, then we have different values, and maybe this isn't the right partnership." The executive sputtered, threatened again, then asked for time to consult with his superior. Sullivan gave him until airtime, 2 hours. Then he hung up and started making calls to other potential sponsors, knowing he might actually need them. His producers were horrified. CBS executives were panicking, but Sullivan didn't back down. He'd made his choice, and he was going to live with the consequences. At 7:55, 5 minutes before airtime, the sponsor called back. They would stay. They weren't happy about it, but they would stay. Whether it was because they decided Sullivan was bluffing and couldn't afford to lose them, or because they actually respected his stand, or because they simply didn't want the public embarrassment of the story getting out, it didn't matter. The dancer would perform. Sullivan walked back to her dressing room and told her she was on in 40 minutes. She was in the second act. Be ready. He didn't tell her about the fight. He didn't tell her what it had cost or what it might still cost. He just told her to dance. And she did. When the lights came up and the orchestra began Tchaikovsky, she walked onto that stage with 3 white dancers, and for 8 minutes they moved together in perfect synchronization. The audience watched a young black woman in a white tutu perform classical ballet on national television, dancing not in a segregated number, not as a novelty, but as an artist, equal to any other artist on that stage. Most viewers at home probably didn't think twice about it, but some did. Letters arrived at CBS over the next week, some hateful, some grateful, all proving that what they'd witnessed mattered. The immediate aftermath was complicated. The sponsor stayed, but the relationship was damaged. Some Southern affiliates received complaints. A few advertisers quietly pulled back from future shows. But something else happened too. Other black performers started getting calls. Other choreographers started integrating their numbers. The change wasn't sudden or dramatic, but a line had been moved, slightly in the right direction. The dancer herself went on to have a successful career, performing on Broadway and eventually teaching, but she said in an interview decades later that the most important moment of her career wasn't opening night of a major show or winning an award. It was standing in the wings at CBS Studio 50, hearing Ed Sullivan tell a sponsor no, and realizing that someone with power had chosen to protect her when he didn't have to. That knowledge, that she'd been worth fighting for, changed how she saw herself. It changed what she believed was possible. What Ed Sullivan did that night in 1955 wasn't revolutionary. He didn't end segregation. He didn't solve racism. One dancer performing on one television show didn't change the material conditions of black Americans living under Jim Crow, but it did something that mattered in a different way. It showed that individuals with institutional power have choices, even when those choices seem impossible. It showed that standing up to pressure is always an option, even when the cost is real. And it showed millions of Americans, in their living rooms on a Sunday night, an image of integration that challenged the story they'd been told about who belonged where. Television in the 1950s was teaching America what normal looked like. Every show, every image, every choice about who appeared and how they appeared was building a collective understanding of American identity. Ed Sullivan had the power to shape that understanding, and in that one moment, he chose to use it for expansion rather than exclusion, for possibility rather than limitation, for a young dancer's dream rather than a sponsor's comfort. The story of that night is documented, but not widely known. It doesn't appear in highlight reel. It wasn't the moment Sullivan is remembered for. Most people remember Elvis, or the Beatles, or one of the countless other iconic performances on his show. But the people who study television history, who track the slow, painful progress of integration in American media, they know this story. They know that Ed Sullivan used his power when he could have protected his comfort. They know that a young black dancer got to perform because one person in authority decided that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. And they know that these moments, small, undramatic, often invisible to the public, are how change actually happens, not through grand declarations or sudden revolutions, but through individual choices made in rooms where money and fear and power are all pushing in one direction, and someone chooses to push back. Years later, someone asked Ed Sullivan about that night, about the sponsor pressure, about the choice he made. His answer was characteristically blunt. She could dance. That's all that mattered. He didn't make it about courage or morality or taking a stand. He made it about talent, about the simple, radical idea that a person's ability should matter more than their skin color. It sounds obvious now, but in 1955, with a sponsor threatening to pull millions of dollars, with network executives panicking, with affiliates in the South preparing to revolt, that simple idea was dangerous, costly, risky, and Ed Sullivan chose it anyway. Not because he was a civil rights activist. He was not because he was trying to make history. He was trying to make a television show. But because when the moment came to either protect a system or protect a person, he chose the person. And that choice rippled outward in ways he probably never fully understood. The young dancer kept that white tutu for the rest of her life. She never wore it again. It was too fragile, too precious, too connected to that one night. But she kept it in a garment bag in her closet. And sometimes when students asked her about her career, she would take it out and tell them the story. Not about the dancing, about the waiting, about sitting in that dressing room, hearing the clock tick, knowing that men in suits were deciding whether she mattered. And then about Ed Sullivan knocking on her door and telling her to get ready. She wanted her students to understand that talent isn't always enough, that there are barriers that have nothing to do with your ability and everything to do with systems designed to keep certain people out. But she also wanted them to understand that those barriers can be broken, that people in power can choose different, that one person saying no to injustice can change what seems possible. If you think about the people who shaped your life, who are they? Are they the ones who followed the rules, who made the safe choices, who protected their own comfort? Or are they the ones who risked something to protect you when they didn't have to? Ed Sullivan had every practical reason to give in to that sponsor, every business reason, every self-protective instinct. But he didn't. He chose to risk his own comfort for someone else's dignity. He chose to use his power to expand possibility rather than enforce limitation. And because of that choice, a young black woman in a white tutu danced on national television, and millions of Americans saw an image of equality that challenged everything their culture had told them was normal. That's power used well. That's what it looks like when someone understands that authority isn't just about control. It's about responsibility. Responsibility to the people who have less power than you. Responsibility to do what's right even when it costs you something. Responsibility to build the world you want to live in rather than accepting the world as it is. What moments from your own life do you remember? Not the successes, not the triumphs, but the moments when someone stood up for you when they could have walked away. When someone risked something to protect your dignity, when someone in power chose humanity over convenience. Those are the moments that show us what character looks like. Those are the moments that remind us we're not alone. And those are the moments like this one from 1955 that deserve to be remembered. Not because they're dramatic or spectacular, but because they're true, because they show us that change is possible, that individuals matter, that choices made in private offices and dressing rooms and phone calls can ripple outward and shift what seems fixed. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that power can be used for protection instead of exclusion, consider subscribe. There are more moments like this waiting to be told. Quiet acts of courage. Decisions made when no one was watching except the people who needed someone to fight for them. Stories about what happens when people in authority remember that their power is only as meaningful as what they choose to do with it.